One thing just about everyone can agree on, the 2016 presidential campaign is like no other. The widespread disapproval of both candidates has raised interesting questions about the proper role of those covering them, and especially those covering Donald Trump. Columnist Nicholas Kristof wrote in a New York Times op-ed, quote, "We owe it to our readers to signal when we're writing about a crackpot, even if he's a presidential candidate. No, especially when he's a presidential candidate." To discuss this and other matters, my colleague Chris Wallace, the host of Fox News Sunday, joins us. Chris, it doesn't sound like he's talking about traditional neutral coverage, does it?
Well, in fairness to him, he's a columnist, so he's entitled to have opinions. But in that column, he not only called Trump a crackpot, he also called him a clown. And he was not just talking about columnists. He was basically saying the idea, and he used this phrase several times, of false equivalence. Well, this is the Republican candidate. That's the Democratic candidate. No, he doesn't want to see that. He wants it basically to say, here's Hillary Clinton. She's a serious candidate. And here's Donald Trump, who's a crackpot and a clown and should be treated as such in news stories as well as in columns.
Well, I think we can all agree that it's perfectly appropriate to do stories in which you fact-check what the candidates say. But when you're writing the news story about who said what on a given day, and, you know, Hillary argues this, Trump argues that, and a different opinion, is it appropriate then to have a parenthetical clause or a couple of sentences in which you try to point out to the viewers or readers subtly or unsubtly that one of them is, in your opinion, a crank?
Well, call me old-fashioned, but no. And I suspect Mr. Kristof's response would be, well, Trump isn't just another candidate. But I have been struck in this campaign, as in no other, by how biased, not the columns. Again, Kristof is a columnist. He can say what he wants. But the news coverage has been. There was an article this week when Donald Trump, whether you think it was serious or not, he proposed his child care plan. And this is the story. I'm old-fashioned. I actually clip it out and so you save it as preparing for the show. And this was the news story about, in the New York Times, front page, about Donald Trump's plan. And let's put up this quote on the screen. He dismisses it. They dismiss it as a new attempt to court female voters who polls show have been alienated by his bombast and history of provocative remarks about women. Now, look, this was before they explained what it was, before they discussed the merits or demerits. They basically said, well, this is just a naked political attempt to counteract his bombast.
Yeah.
That's a little bit over the line.
I agree. I would think that you could find polls that will show that a lot of women were offended by Donald Trump and maybe by certain specific things. I doubt we'll be able to find a poll that asks people what they think of his, quote, bombast.
Right.
I mean, that's clearly the journalist's opinion of what people were reacting to, wouldn't you say?
Well, and again, I am astonished. That's in the second paragraph of a front page story of a plan. Again, you can argue with it good or bad. Look, there's plenty that you can argue about both of these candidates. I think Donald Trump today at least opening the door to the birther issue by refusing to say to Robert Costa in the Washington Post when he asked him in an interview, are you willing to say now that Obama was born in America? He said, well, no, I'm not willing to say that.
But he finally did later today.
He did finally today say it, but he opened the door. That's a perfectly legitimate story, but to just suddenly lard news coverage with your opinions.
And the argument was made in the Kristof column that yeah, Hillary Clinton has fudged the truth and she's spun and she's cut and woven, if you will, but Trump has told many a more whopper than he has. Is it possible to measure the two candidates' prevarications in such a way that you can reach a final judgment about who's the bigger liar?
Well, there is one argument, and that is that the Washington Post fact-checker, Glenn Kessler, who I think does a serious, solid job, has fact-checked them, and I don't know the exact number, but by a multiple of several, has found more Trump whoppers than Clinton whoppers. Again, though, I don't know that I think that's the issue. I mean, I don't think that people are going to be making a decision with a false impression about Trump and Clinton. I think they know what these people stand for, and I think they know where they think that they've told the truth and where they've gone over the line. I just think people are going to make a judgment of who they'd want to have as their president, but I don't think it's for lack of coverage.
Yeah, I agree with that. I also would suggest we here at Fox caught a lot of grief from a lot of viewers, many of them even conservatives who don't like Donald Trump, for the extent of the live coverage that we provided during the primary seasons here. And people say that to me, you invented this guy, you created him. And my view of that is, well, if we created him by covering him so extensively, live events so extensively, then surely we must also be responsible for the fact that he has the highest negatives of anybody.
Well, and since you all have been panelists on my show, you and George Will and Charles Krauthammer have, over the course of the primaries and now the general election, expressed repeated doubts about this guy and about the specifics of his plan, so I hardly think he's gotten a free pass on Fox or any place else.
I might plead with you to note that now I've now stepped into a different role.
Well, I understand you're an anchor now.
My opinion,
too busy for Fox News Sunday.
Not at all. I miss being on, but I've stepped into a role where my analysis is to be diminished a little bit. Chris, tell me about your Sunday show coming up. Who you got and
this is going to sound like Ed Sullivan. We got a really good show this week. First of all, Tim Kaine. First time I'm going to be interviewing him as the Democratic running mate to Hillary Clinton. Obviously, a lot to talk about with what's going on with Clinton this week, her health and various issues in a tightening race. We're going to talk then live in response to Chris Christie, who's a top Trump advisor and also the head of his transition team.
Right.
George Clooney. Wait, there's more, talking about the terrible civil war and massive corruption in South Sudan. And finally, a preview of the National African American Museum, which I saw this week. Sensational. I promise you, you're going to want to go see it.
That'll be 9 o'clock here in Washington for me. For other viewers,
check your local listings.
Check your local listings. That's on the Fox Broadcast Network, where you see the NFL games. Chris, sounds like a great show. Thanks for coming on.